You know that feeling when you're alone in an elevator, and suddenly the doors open at a random floor and someone steps in who just doesn't feel right. That uncomfortable silence, that weird energy, that little voice in your head telling you something's off? Well, what I'm about to share with you goes way beyond just feeling uncomfortable. These are 4 real encounters that happen to ordinary people in elevators, and trust me, after hearing these stories, you'll never look at those small metal boxes the same way again. I've spent weeks digging through forums, reaching out to people who lived through these experiences and verifying every detail I could. What you're about to hear isn't fiction, it's not urban legends, and it's definitely not something you'd want to experience yourself. Now, before we dive into these stories, I want you to think about this for a second. Elevators are these weird little spaces where we're trapped with complete strangers for minutes at a time. No escape route, no way out until those doors decide to open. Most of the time, nothing happens. We stare at the floor numbers, avoid eye contact, and get off at our destination. But sometimes, just sometimes, you end up sharing that confined space with someone who shouldn't be there. The first story comes from a woman named Sarah, who was working late at her office building in downtown Chicago. This happened about 2 years ago, and she still refuses to work past 6 in the evening. The second story involves a college student who encountered something in a dorm elevator that made him question his own sanity. The third one takes place in a hospital elevator, and let me tell you, hospitals are already creepy enough without what happened to this nurse. And the final story, well, that one involves a maintenance worker who discovered something in an elevator shaft that still gives him nightmares. I've got to warn you, these stories get pretty intense. If you're someone who already has a fear of elevators, you might want to click away now. But if you're like me and you're fascinated by these real-life encounters that prove truth really is stranger than fiction, then stick around, because what you're about to hear will absolutely blow your mind. Also, if you've had your own disturbing elevator experience, make sure to share it in the comments below. I read every single one, and who knows, maybe your story will make it into a future video. But for now, let's get started with Sarah's story. Sarah worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized firm on the 32nd floor of a downtown office building. She'd been there for about 3 years and was used to staying late to finish projects. The building was one of those older high-rises from the 70s, with that typical corporate feel and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly yellow. On this particular Thursday evening in November, Sarah was wrapping up a presentation that was due the next morning. She'd lost track of time and realized it was already past 9 when she finally saved her work and started packing up her things. The office was completely empty by then, which wasn't unusual. Most people cleared out by 6, and the cleaning crew didn't come until after 10. She gathered her laptop, threw on her coat, and headed toward the elevator bank. The hallway was dimly lit with only every other light fixture on, creating these long shadows that stretched across the carpet. She pressed the down button and waited, listening to the mechanical hum of the elevator climbing up the shaft. When the doors opened with that familiar ding, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator was one of those older models with the fake wood paneling and mirrors on three sides. As the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, Sarah pulled out her phone to check her messages. Everything seemed normal until the elevator stopped on the 18th floor. Sarah looked up from her phone expecting to see a security guard or maybe another late worker getting on. But when the doors opened, the hallway was completely dark. Not just dimly lit like her floor had been, but pitch black. She waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe someone had pressed the button by mistake or that the motion sensors would trigger the lights, but nothing happened. The doors started to close and Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from the darkness of the 18th floor. Someone was walking toward the elevator, but she couldn't see anyone. The footsteps got closer and closer, and Sarah frantically pressed the close door button, but these older elevators take their sweet time. Just as the doors were about to close completely, a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed the edge of the door. The elevator doors bounced back open and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. But there was still no one visible in the hallway, just that hand, pale and thin, gripping the door frame. Sarah pressed herself against the back wall of the elevator, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. The hand slowly pulled back and she heard those footsteps again, this time entering the elevator. The sound of shoes on the elevator floor was unmistakable, but she couldn't see anyone. The doors closed and Sarah realized she was no longer alone in the elevator. She could hear breathing, slow and steady, coming from the area right next to her. She looked in the mirrors, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was in there with her, but all she saw was her own terrified reflection. The elevator continued its descent, stopping at every single floor between 18 and the lobby. At each stop, the doors would open, revealing empty hallways, and then close again. But the breathing never stopped. It was like someone was standing right beside her, invisible but definitely there. By the time they reached the lobby, Sarah was in full panic mode. The doors opened to the familiar sight of the security desk and the marble floor of the building's entrance. She bolted out of the elevator without looking back, ran straight to the security guard and tried to explain what had happened. The guard, a middle-aged man who'd been working there for years, looked at her with concern but also skepticism. He walked over to the elevator and peered inside. It was completely empty. He checked the security cameras, but the footage showed Sarah entering the elevator alone on the 32nd floor and exiting alone in the lobby. But here's the thing that made Sarah's blood run cold. When the security guard pulled up the footage from the 18th floor, they could see the hallway clearly. It wasn't dark at all. The lights were on, and there was absolutely no one in that hallway. No hand grabbing the door, no footsteps, nothing. Sarah never worked late again after that night. She transferred to a different department on a lower floor within a month, and she still takes the stairs whenever possible. She's convinced that something was in that elevator with her. Something that the cameras couldn't pick up, but that she could definitely hear and feel. Now you might be thinking that Sarah was just tired, that her mind was playing tricks on her after a long day at work. But wait until you hear what happened to Marcus, a sophomore at Northwestern University, in his dorm elevator just 3 months later. Marcus was heading back to his room on the 9th floor after a late study session in the library. It was around midnight on a Tuesday and the dorm was pretty quiet. Most students were either asleep or cramming for midterms in their rooms. He called the elevator and waited, scrolling through his phone while the familiar mechanical sounds echoed in the empty hallway. The elevator arrived and Marcus stepped inside, pressing the button for the 9th floor. As the doors closed, he noticed something odd. The button for the basement level was lit up, even though he definitely hadn't pressed it. The building did have a basement level with laundry facilities and storage rooms, but it required a special key card to access, and Marcus had never been down there. The elevator began its descent, but instead of going up to the 9th floor, it went down. Marcus pressed the 9th floor button again, but nothing happened. The elevator continued downward, past the lobby, past the first basement level, and kept going. Marcus had never known the building had multiple basement levels. When the doors finally opened, Marcus found himself staring into a hallway he'd never seen before. The walls were concrete, painted that institutional green color that screams government building or hospital basement. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting these eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Marcus didn't want to get out, but the elevator doors stayed open. After about 30 seconds, he heard the sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere deep in the basement. They were getting closer. He frantically pressed the closed door button, but like Sarah's elevator, this one seemed to be taking its time. The footsteps were getting louder now, and Marcus could hear something else. Whistling. Someone was whistling a tune he didn't recognize. Something old and haunting. The sound bounced off the concrete walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Just as the doors started to close, Marcus saw a figure emerge from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was a man in what looked like a maintenance uniform, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His gait was too stiff, too mechanical, like he was forcing each step. And his face, what Marcus could see of it, was completely expressionless. The man raised his hand and waved at Marcus, still whistling that creepy tune. The elevator doors closed just as the figure started walking toward them. Marcus pressed the 9th floor button repeatedly, his heart pounding in his chest. The elevator lurched upward, and he let out a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. The elevator stopped at the first basement level and the doors opened again. The same maintenance man was standing right there as if he'd somehow beaten the elevator upstairs. He stepped into the elevator without saying a word, still whistling that haunting melody. Marcus pressed himself against the back wall of the elevator, just like Sarah had done. The man stood facing the doors, not acknowledging Marcus at all. He just kept whistling. The elevator continued upward, stopping at every floor, but the doors wouldn't open. They'd just sit there for a few seconds while the man continued his eerie tune. When they finally reached the 9th floor, the doors opened, and the man stepped out first. He walked down the hallway toward Marcus's room, still whistling. Marcus waited until the man disappeared around the corner before getting out of the elevator himself. He ran to his room, locked the door, and called campus security. When they arrived 20 minutes later, there was no sign of any maintenance worker. They They checked the basement levels, and according to the security guard, there was no basement level below the laundry room. The building plans showed only one basement level, not the multiple levels Marcus had descended to. The next morning, Marcus asked his resident advisor about the maintenance staff. He was told that all maintenance work was done during the day, and there were no overnight maintenance workers in the building. Marcus never used that elevator again, and he moved to a different dorm the following semester. Our third story takes place in a hospital, and it involves a nurse named Patricia who was working the night shift at a regional medical center. Patricia had been a nurse for over 15 years, so she was used to the weird atmosphere that hospitals have at night. But what happened to her in the elevator that night was unlike anything she'd experienced in her career. Patricia was heading up to the 7th floor to check on a patient when she got into the elevator on the 3rd floor. As the doors closed, she noticed that the button for the morgue level was already lit up. This struck her as odd because the morgue was restricted access, and she definitely hadn't pressed that button. The elevator went down instead of up, stopping at the morgue level. When the doors opened, Patricia was greeted by the familiar sight of the sterile white hallway that led to the morgue. But standing in the hallway was an elderly man in a hospital gown, looking confused and lost. Patricia immediately went into nurse mode. She got out of the elevator and approached the man, thinking he was a patient who had wandered off from his room. But as she got closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. The man's skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were vacant, staring straight ahead without blinking. She asked him if he was okay, if he needed help getting back to his room. The man turned to look at her, and Patricia felt her blood run cold. His eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just white. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a thick, dark liquid began to pour from his mouth. Patricia backed away, her training telling her this was some kind of medical emergency, but every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. The man started walking toward her, that dark liquid still flowing from his mouth and now from his nose as well. She ran back to the elevator and frantically pressed the button for the 7th floor. The doors closed just as the man reached them, and Patricia could hear him pounding on the metal doors as the elevator ascended. She immediately called security and reported what she'd seen. Security checked the morgue level, but there was no elderly man in a hospital gown. They checked the patient roster, and there were no missing patients. The security footage showed Patricia entering the elevator alone and exiting alone. There was no record of anyone else being on the morgue level that night. Patricia quit her job the next week. She couldn't bring herself to work in that hospital anymore, knowing that something was wandering the halls that shouldn't be there. She now works at a small clinic during the day and refuses to set foot in any hospital after dark. Our final story comes from a maintenance worker named Tony, who discovered something in an elevator shaft that still haunts him to this day. Tony had been working maintenance in office buildings for over 20 years, so he thought he'd seen everything. But what he found in that elevator shaft proved him wrong. Tony was called to fix an elevator that had been making strange noises and occasionally stopping between floors. It was an older building and these kinds of problems were common. He shut down the elevator and prepared to inspect the shaft from the basement level. When he opened the shaft access door, he immediately noticed something unusual. There were scratches on the walls of the shaft, deep gouges in the concrete that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. But they were too high up to have been made by someone standing on the ground. Tony climbed into the shaft to get a better look, and that's when he saw it. About 15 feet up, there was a small alcove in the wall that he'd never noticed before. It looked like it had been carved out of the concrete, and there were more scratches around the opening. He climbed up to investigate, and what he found inside that alcove made his stomach turn. There were bones, old and yellowed, along with scraps of clothing and what looked like personal belongings. But the most disturbing part was the scratches on the walls inside the alcove, covering every surface. Tony immediately called the police, and when they investigated, they discovered that the bones belonged to a maintenance worker who had disappeared from the building over 30 years ago. The man had apparently fallen into the shaft and somehow managed to climb into the alcove, but then couldn't get out. The scratches on the walls told the story of his final days, clawing desperately at the concrete, trying to escape. But here's the part that still gives Tony nightmares. According to the coroner's report, the man had been dead for decades, but some of the scratches looked fresh. Very fresh. Tony refuses to work on elevators anymore. He's convinced that something is still in that shaft, still trying to claw its way out. The building was eventually demolished, but Tony says he can still hear the scratching sounds in his dreams. These 4 stories might seem unbelievable, but they're all documented encounters from real people who experienced something that defied explanation. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, these stories serve as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary terrors. The next time you step into an elevator, remember Sarah's invisible companion, Marcus's whistling maintenance man, Patricia's morgue patient, and Tony's discovery in the shaft. Sometimes the most frightening encounters happen in the spaces we use every day, the places we feel safe, the moments when we're just trying to get from one floor to another. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more real encounters like these, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And remember, if you've had your own disturbing elevator experience, share it in the comments below. Your story might just be featured in the next video. Until next time, stay safe and maybe consider taking the stairs.